Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the SQE and supporting students who require adjustments. I am Zoe Allen Robinson. I manage the AML Proactive team at the SRA. I'm delighted to chair today's discussion. A fair access to all is a topic I'm passionate about, and I'm a trustee for a site charity, and I also chair the SRA's staff network, Accessibility, that looks to promote equality of opportunity for disabled colleagues, and I'm also a qualified solicitor. So this is an issue that's really close to my heart, and there are many reasons for that, but one of which is that I have a sight condition that I chose not to disclose during my legal education, and I believe I made this experience more difficult than it needed to be for myself. And as a result, I do not think I did as well as I maybe could have done if I had disclosed it. Reasonable adjustments can sometimes be seen to mean different things, and I therefore use this platform as an opportunity to urge candidates that might be listening and wish to sit the solicitor's qualifying exam or other legal qualifications to speak up if you do need adjustments to be able to sit an exam, but also if you need adjustments to perform at the best of your ability. So this webinar is aimed at candidates and training providers, and you can watch it again on catch up through YouTube or the SRA website if you'd wish to. We know that a lot of candidates have training providers, but we also know that some may not and are self-learning. So the speakers I have joining me will bear that in mind as we go through this. We'll be covering topics such as why this is such a key area, the approach we are taking to reasonable adjustments, the practicalities of applying for reasonable adjustments, how things are going so far with applications and what's coming up in this area. There is a link below that you can use to submit questions to us during the webinar, so I would encourage you to do so. And I guess next is to kick off with panel introductions. So I'd like to introduce Richard Williams. He is a policy manager at the SRA and has been working with Kaplan and disability groups to help design and develop the SQE reasonable adjustments policy. We're also joined by Yanis Chrysanthou, a corporate lawyer by background and head of stakeholder engagement at Kaplan for the SQE. And also Jackie Panther, Head of Equality and Quality at Kaplan. Jackie is fairly new to the role, so we'll want to hear a bit more about your background, Jackie, later in the webinar. So Richard, if you could start us off and remind people watching, what is the SRA's position on helping all candidates taking the SQE?
Thanks, Zoe. And I think that the first point really is to reiterate that we as the regulator want to see as wide range of candidates as possible to taking the SQE. So, and really the rationale for that is that we think everyone should have an equal opportunity to qualify as a solicitor, and this involves giving the opportunity for everyone to take the SQE assessments, and as you've mentioned, to perform to the best of their ability. And that's, this is crucial not only as an issue of fairness or kind of legal obligation, but it's also about us as a regulator doing what we can to kind of increase the diversity within the profession, because our view is that a more diverse profession is in fact a stronger profession. And you touched on it in your introduction, we also want to give confidence to individuals who may be considering taking the SQE and who may have a disability, that there's a really clear, robust and supportive process in place to help them. And we want to work with training providers as well to make sure that they are best placed to give their students confidence, guidance, and can support them in making a reasonable adjustment application. So with all that kind of being said, I think we really welcome and encourage applications from all candidates who require a reasonable adjustment.
Thank you, Richard. That's really good to hear. And in terms of it would be probably quite helpful if you could give a quick overview and background to the development of the reasonable adjustments policy.
So, certainly, we've been engaging with individuals with disabilities, interest groups, stakeholder groups who represent those with disabilities for quite a number of years now. And, that's been incredibly helpful for us because it's helped us to better understand the challenges that those individuals might face and who want to take the SQE. And, I think it would be good for me to kind of thank those individuals and groups at this stage for their valuable kind of input, time, and helping us develop this policy. And that process has really helped to shape and refine the reasonable adjustments policy. We've had lots of useful suggestions from those individuals and groups that we've used to develop and enhance the approach that we've got in place today. For example, we've had some really helpful suggestions around the types of examples of reasonable adjustments that we could provide to kind of illustrate the types of reasonable adjustments or conditions that might well be accounted for in taking the SQE. And we've also had really good suggestions about the types of guidance that we need to provide. Where are the gaps in people's understandings? And we've been able to fill them working with Kaplan, so that's incredibly helpful. And also the appeal element of the reasonable adjustment policy. We've had some really good stakeholder feedback on that. So that process has been incredibly helpful. I think it's important we all carry on with that dialogue to make sure that the reasonable adjustments policy is working and continues to work.
No, that's great to hear in terms of listening to experts in their field or experienced people as that's being built. So Jackie, as you are new to post, it'd be good to hear about your background and for you to maybe introduce the work of the Equality and Quality team at Kaplan.
Yes, sorry. So I'm the new head of Equality and Quality at Kaplan SQE. My background, I'm a qualified solicitor and was in practice in Manchester. My most recent role was as Deputy Head of the Law School at Manchester Metropolitan University. I made the move to this position because I saw it as an opportunity to be at the forefront of this new pathway to becoming licensed as a solicitor. And the position really pulls together so many aspects of my previous experience in practice as a solicitor, my roles in higher education, and from other voluntary roles that I've had and in projects that I've been involved in. My team, the Equality and Quality team, has responsibility to make decisions about the applications for reasonable adjustments. The team's there to support candidates who have questions and advise candidates who need reasonable adjustments in the SQE assessments. It's currently a small team, but we have over 40 years of experience in higher education and for working with assessment providers.
Thank you, Jackie. We're now about 3 months in since bookings opened. Can you give us an update on the process and how we're getting on with the first round of bookings?
Yeah, registrations opened on the 6th of July and we received our first application straight away. In the last 12 weeks, approximately 1 in 8 candidates who've booked for SQE, the SQE1 exam in November, have applied for reasonable adjustments. So we've had a fair number of applications.
Thank you, Jackie. And have many reasonable adjustment arrangements been agreed yet? How are things progressing in terms of those that you've received?
They've been progressing as we anticipated, really. Almost 70% of the applications for reasonable adjustments have been agreed with the candidates and are finalised. No applications to date have been rejected. And as expected, we've had a range of requests from candidates who've requested extra time because they have, for example, dyslexia. We've made provision for pregnant or nursing mothers, but we've had more complex reasonable adjustment applications where we've needed to discuss and support candidates to identify a reasonable adjustment plan and support at the assessment centre. So some of the applications, most of them have been quite simple and straightforward. In other cases, a member of the team, a candidate's reasonable adjustment liaison, speaks to the candidate to understand the adjustments that they need, assess what's reasonable, and for us to take proactive steps in order to be able to advise the candidate.
Thank you, Jackie. And if we could maybe pause to explain and describe the candidate account, Yanis, and how you found this working in practice.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Zoe. So in terms of the application for the reasonable adjustment, that is typically made via the candidate's individual account that is set up on registration. And so far that's working very well. And of course, when we complete our round of assessments, we will be seeking feedback from candidates. But so far, so good. The candidate was designed and tested by one of our partners to help us on the accessibility front. So it's designed to be accessible to candidates, and we're committed to making sure that is the case. But as was made very clear to us during our development of the policy from the various groups that we worked with, candidates can, of course, approach us using other means of communication. So if for any reason they can't use the candidate account to make the application, or they have any issues with it, then they are welcome to approach us, and we'll agree different means of communication with them, and we'll help them and we'll work with them to make sure that they can make the application. If it needs to be done in a different way, then we will assist them with that.
Thank you, Yanis. It's good to hear. And back to you, Jackie, if you could maybe, we've heard a bit about sort of the practical thing with the candidate account. Could you talk about the process and the candidate journey?
Certainly. So as Yanis has said, a candidate goes on to the SQE website and registers for the SQE, on the website and within the portal. Candidates don't need to book an exam to register for the SQE. Candidates are asked if they need reasonable adjustments as part of the registration process. So it's right at the beginning of the registration process. Candidates complete a reasonable adjustments application form, and they're asked for information and supporting documentation about the nature of a disability or condition, the impact of that on the assessment, and the details of the adjustments that they need to address their needs in the assessment. That application then comes to my team, and a member of the team is allocated to be the candidate's reasonable adjustment liaison. So it's one point of contact for the candidate. In most cases, the application's straightforward and communication can be dealt with just by email correspondence. In some cases, candidates need to speak to their reasonable adjustments liaison, or we want to speak to the candidate to clarify points or to advise them based upon the information that we have. We aim to provide a decision as quickly as possible. For this run of SQE1 for November 2021, most decisions have been made within 5 working days of a complete application. But in a small number of cases for this first run, and particularly in complex cases, it has been a little bit longer.
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, this seems a good time to ask about assistive technology. We know that this is an area CAPLA have been looking at, not just in terms of accessibility for candidates that have visual impairments, but also the use of assistive technology more generally as part of reasonable adjustments. I also know there's been some queries in particular about the use of assistive tech and those with visual impairments. So could you provide us with an update on this area?
Yes, certainly. There's a range of assistive technologies that are integrated into the assessment and at test centres. So tools such as adjustable fonts, adjustable contrast and colour adaptations, zoom text, magnification software, and what we've been focusing on particularly is the screen reader. We're using JAWS, which is the most popular screen reader, but we're dealing with this on a case-by-case approach. We're working to expand the list of illustrative examples of reasonable adjustments that can be easily made. But as I've said, we've been focusing first on screen reader software for the first assessments because of the feedback that we've been having with those stakeholder groups.
Thank you. So JAWS is available, Zoom text and other ones. So am I right in thinking that nothing is off limits in terms of what assistive tech might be available? As I understand, certain people are used to and comfortable with certain types of tools. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. All requests for assistive technology can be considered. Nothing is barred. We're encouraging candidates to approach us, even if the type of assistive technology that they're looking for isn't listed on the list of indicative reasonable adjustments.
Great, thank you. And Yanis, this might be a good time to talk about the guidance on reasonable adjustments on the SQE website. Can you detail this about what information is available?
Yes, absolutely. So again, this has been brought about by the work we've been doing with the different groups during the last few months. So most recently, we published a short article on the SQE website just to help clarify and cover some of the points. So addressing the availability of JAWS, also updating the list of illustrative examples on the website to cover some other conditions and disabilities that stakeholders suggested they would like to see in that illustration to give further guidance to candidates and training providers as to what is easily and readily available. And what we've also done is we've made that table a bit more prominent on the website as well, so it's easier for candidates to find if they're searching for the type of reasonable adjustment that may be available. We've also put information there just to make it clear that candidates should approach us as early as they possibly can for a decision, and also, as Jackie said, just making it clear that there will be one member of Jackie's team that is the liaison for that candidate to provide that continuity where possible. So I'd urge all candidates and training providers to look at the Q&As on the website.
Yeah, and I suppose a logical question there is about the website. Have you considered accessibility issues in terms of people being able to use the website and access the information you just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can imagine, we've carried out numerous tests on accessibility. We want to make sure it's fully accessible, and we're aiming to meet the AA level of accessibility in terms of the standard, and that's what we're aiming for and working towards. And with the Digital Accessibility Centre, one of our partners that's been providing us with the testing and updates to the website. So we've been working closely with them and other individuals that have disabilities to help test the website and provide feedback. And it's an ongoing process, and we do have our accessibility statement on the website, so everyone can see what we're aiming for and what's available. But just to give you a flavour, for instance, we want to make sure that the website can be read by the popular screen readers. We want to make sure that the website can be magnified to a certain extent without the text spilling over the edge of the page, and the fact that it's available in a format that is easily readable for candidates. So those facilities are there and they're available. But as I say, as you can imagine, there are still some updates to be done, and that's on an ongoing basis that we're working on that.
Thanks, Jackys, and thanks for giving us a flavour of sort of the things that are available and that you've considered in terms of the website. And I think you mentioned this when you were talking about the candidate account, but it would be good to hear sort of if people do have issues with the website, what should they do if they struggle?
Yeah, absolutely. They should. The first port of call, if possible, is just to call the candidate services team and to talk through what the issues are, or they can send them an email. So that's really the first port of call. And it may be that the issue can be resolved relatively easily. If not, or if they do need to speak to a member of Jackie's team, then the candidate services team will arrange for that to take place as well. So they should definitely get in touch with us if there are any issues, or indeed if they've got any general questions that we can help with.
Great, thank you, Jackys. And Jackie, I understand the DWP figures suggest that 19% of adults in the UK are disabled, and I know you mentioned some figures earlier about sort of 1 in 8 of your applicants have asked for reasonable adjustments. So it suggests to me that there's maybe more people that potentially need those adjustments. What recommendations can you make to candidates and training providers, or can you share any lessons learned so far?
Yes, certainly. The statistic that you've just mentioned, about 19% of adults, certainly we've looked at that in terms of the figures of the candidates who have applied for reasonable adjustments, and the number of applications that we've had is a little bit lower than those we had expected. We've looked again at, we've reviewed the website, and Jackys has just explained that we've made some adjustments to the website to make the information more prominent. We're having events such as this to explain and highlight the process, to answer questions and provide information about the process. And the SRA have been providing information in the SQE bulletins that have been going out. But it's a concern that we've had lower than expected numbers of applications. So I would encourage, if anybody's got any questions, if they're not quite sure if they should be applying, they're not sure about the process, as Jackys has said, please get in touch to ask us as soon as possible. We're here to support anybody who has a question, anybody who may need adjustments to put them in the strongest and the best position to succeed with their exams. In terms of other lessons to be learned so far in this first round, early application for reasonable adjustments, that would be the big take home that I would like to emphasise in this webinar. For candidates, please register for the SQE and make an application for reasonable adjustments, even if you're not sure when or if you will be sitting the exams. There's no cost implication. You're not asked at the point of registering or at the point of applying for reasonable adjustments for any commitment to sit the exam. An A-level candidate or somebody who is still at university and hasn't really decided if and when they will do the SQE exams can apply to register for the SQE and can apply for reasonable adjustments. That means that on application, we can make a decision that will first provide the candidate with information about the support that they will have for the exams. It'll get the task out of the way. And certainly for candidates who will be moving on to programmes of learning with training providers to help support them in preparation for their SQE, then those candidates will be able to provide the training provider with the details of the adjustments that have been agreed with us at the start of their programme of learning, so they can align and do that programme of learning with reference to what the end point adjustments will be in the exam. The adjustments can be reviewed if circumstances change, and if people are not sure, please get in touch. For training providers, I would ask them please to ask their learners to register for the SQE and apply for reasonable adjustments as soon as possible, ideally before they start the programme of learning. Speaking to the training providers, if those who are in the webinar remember the old days where LPC candidates would have to apply for a certificate of suitability and character before they register for the LPC, although it's not required to apply for reasonable adjustments, if we can support candidates by encouraging them to register for the SQE as soon as possible before they start their programme of learning, and register and apply and agree their reasonable adjustments before the programme of learning, that means that we can work with the candidates, and the candidates can work with their training providers to incorporate those adjustments into the programmes of learning and into their mock exams for the SQE. So the big takeaway for me would be, if there's any questions, please get in touch. And second of all, for candidates, please register as soon as possible and apply for those RAs.
Thank you, Jackie, and this is definitely a helpful discussion. It's good to hear that where things are being picked up, changes are being made. I suppose, Yanis, if I could ask you, how are you going to check that these have been successful and sort of check on your own progress as this develops and people sit the exams?
No, so absolutely. So I think I'd like to reiterate what Richard said earlier in regards to thanking the different groups and stakeholders that have helped us get to this point in terms of developing the policy and actually going through the first cycle of reasonable adjustments applications. I guess that the nice thing is now we can move on to the continuous cycle of improvement. So this is very much the first step, and we have to continue, and we have to continue improving. So the first point really is that we'll seek the feedback from the candidates. Now that we have got candidates registering and candidates will take the assessment, we will be seeking their feedback. Jackie and her team are having conversations with the candidates where they give very, very clear and candid feedback during those conversations. But of course, we'll be having our candidate feedback survey that does contain questions around reasonable adjustments. So that's a key tool for us. And then we'll also be asking candidates as part of that if they'd be willing to have further discussions with us so we can get more qualitative feedback from them on their experience of the process and the complete journey of their reasonable adjustments experience. So that's always the starting point, hearing from the candidates and learning from that. We've also committed to putting on the website some testimonials. Again, once we have the first cohort of candidates, we'll be asking candidates if they're willing to work with us so we can actually have some anonymized testimonials on the website that give the first-hand account of their experiences of reasonable adjustments. We'll be doing that for SQE1, And then when we get through the first cycle of SQE2, we'll be doing the same thing. So it's having that primary source and making that available for all candidates and indeed training providers and any stakeholder to see. And then finally, it's kind of, I think, worth mentioning that any feedback we'll get, we'll consider. So if that's informal feedback or even if it's just an email sent to the candidate services team, that will come through to Jackie's team and to myself, and we'll look at that and we'll work on that. And the Q&As that we have on the website, the primary source of written guidance that's there, that has always been designed to be questions that can be developed and added to over time. So we've made some enhancements to that over the last few weeks. And of course, the plan is that as we have more feedback from candidates, from stakeholder groups, from training providers, etc., that we can then update those answers and those questions in a way that accords to the feedback that is the most helpful for candidates to see. So I think the point here is that this is very much the first step. We're planned for the first cycle of improvement, and it's going to be a continuous cycle of improvement as well. And we'll continue to work with the stakeholder groups as we have done over the last few months.
Thanks, Janis. It's good to hear. And you did mention training providers. If they've sort of looked at the information in the Q&As and they want some more information or to speak with Kaplan, is there anything sort of scheduled in terms of training providers, or what's the best method for them to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad you asked that, because we have had a few questions from training providers about this. So as you can imagine, the focus has very much been on candidates at the moment, and they have a very clear line of communication with the equality and quality team, perhaps firstly via the candidate services team. The training providers can, of course, write in or contact the candidate services team if they need to, and we'll get in touch. But what we're planning to do is have a series of meetings for training providers, registered SQE training providers that want to talk to us about reasonable adjustments in more detail. And what I'd urge them to do is if they could just send a very straightforward email to the candidate services team saying that they'd like to meet to discuss reasonable adjustments, and we'll see the best way to put those meetings in place. And of course, as I said, if there are kind of individual questions, they can of course always email or call the candidate services team, and they can take that forward with someone like myself or Jackie. So the key thing is if training providers do want to speak to us, to have meetings with Jackie and the team, then if they could just drop an email to the candidate services team, that would be the way forward.
Yeah, it certainly strikes me. It's important that encouraging that engagement directly with the providers, and I understand we will be putting those contact details up at the end of the webinar for any training providers listening or anyone that wishes to contact Kaplan directly. And I think, Richard, finally, what are the SRA doing in this space to check that it's working as intended?
I think it's a really good question, Zoe. And I think one of the themes that's hopefully come across in terms of this kind of webinar is that as Janis quite rightly put, the work doesn't stop here. I think we, as well as Kaplan, will continue to engage with the widest range of disability groups and individuals that we can, to really kind of help us identify, I suppose, how the reasonable adjustment policy is working in practice. Whether there are any additional challenges that people are facing, whether there's any more information people need, and and to help us to identify kind of any potential solutions to any kind of issues that might arise. So I think work will continue. We'll continue to speak to lots of organisations. I think in addition to that, I think it's just to point out that our role is really about, as I've just described, monitoring how well this is working. So we will be watching how it's implemented, and we will be looking to kind of challenge Kaplan essentially if we're if things aren't particularly going as planned, and we'll work as I said, with a range of stakeholders to identify solutions. So I think that's as probably much as we can say at this stage, but I think it's important that people understand we are looking at this. And of course we have the wider SQE evaluation, which looks at the SQE more holistically, which will touch on this issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, ever so important. Obviously, one of the big selling points, wasn't it, of the solicitors qualifying exam, that it is diverse and increases that diversity in the profession. So glad to hear the role that we're playing as a regulator. Thanks, Richard. So that actually brings us to the chance to answer some questions. We have received some questions while we've been talking. So question in from Nick, maybe if I give this one to you, Jackie. Is there a cut-off point for the November exams beyond which it would be too late for a student to apply for a reasonable adjustment?
Well, the booking window for the November exams closes at 5 o'clock on Monday. So if a candidate needs to apply before 5 o'clock on Monday to register for the exam. But if circumstances change after 5 o'clock on Monday and either a condition flares up or a temporary condition arises, or somebody suddenly appreciates that's something that should have been raised earlier on, needs to then get in touch with the team. But because of booking numbers and because of the organisation of all of the candidates and the assessment centres, candidates need to book for the exam by 5 o'clock on Monday.
But if I've understood correctly, that does mean that, you know, if possible, we can arrange those adjustments after that booking date, so long as getting in touch about your circumstances. Yeah, that's great. And so we've had a question from Kindness. Are reasonable adjustments only open to candidates with disabilities? Maybe Yanis, if you could take that one for us.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll start, and if I miss anything, Jackie, feel free to interrupt. So, as you can imagine, with the structure of reasonable adjustments and what they're designed to do, we focus on candidates that have disabilities or particular conditions, and the idea is to try to give those individuals the best and fairest opportunity to sit and take the SQE. So that's really the focus of the legislation and of our policy. But what I would say to guidance is, if you have any doubts as to whether or not you need a reasonable adjustment, then the best thing to do is to get in touch and raise that question and speak to a member of Jackie's team to see whether indeed a reasonable adjustment is applicable to you. So, for example, if we have, I think Jackie gave the example of nursing mothers. So technically, I don't believe that's classed as a disability under the appropriate legislation, but that's the kind of thing we may be able to help with within the process of the reasonable adjustment provision.
Thank you, Yanis. Was there anything further? Sorry, Jackie, you wanted to add in on that?
No, absolutely. The reasonable adjustments policy, as you can see on the website, is not limited to candidates who are disabled. It's broader than that, and we will support anybody who applies. We will support them and advise them based upon their individual circumstances.
That's great. Yeah. And we've had a question from Deborah, another one maybe for you to pick up for us, Jackie. Are students able to book before they have received reasonable adjustment approval? Appreciate it might be case by case, this one. But...
It depends at what point a candidate wants to raise reasonable adjustments, because when a candidate registers for the SQE, then one of their first questions is to indicate if they have reasonable adjustments. And if the answer to that is yes, they're taken out of the process and come to my team for us to engage with the client, the candidate, to identify what those needs are and to agree what adjustments need to be in place. And part of that is about the location of the test centre. So a candidate wouldn't personally book onto the exam if they have indicated that they have reasonable adjustments. If a candidate has already booked and registered and booked for the SQE and then wants to raise an application for reasonable adjustments, then we'll speak to the candidate as part of their application to assess if the original test centre location where they have registered is appropriate, depending on the adjustments that have been agreed.
Yeah, so it kind of links in, if we've understood correctly, Deborah's question to I think it was Richard at the beginning, where you know, it's not insurmountable if these things are raised at a later stage. That's great. Thank you, Jackie. So some of the questions: who can provide information or evidence in support of my reasonable adjustments request? Maybe Yanis?
Yeah, I can take this, and then
you.
Jackie, of course, Jackie, please do interrupt if anything's incorrect. But yeah, essentially, I would urge individuals to look at the Q&As here. This question actually is covered on the website, but it's a really good question to raise. So in terms of who can provide the information in support of a reasonable adjustment request, it's really whoever is the most qualified and appropriate person to do so for that individual candidate. So as you can imagine, that could be a range of individuals. It could be a physiotherapist, it could be a GP, it could be a specialist consultant. It really depends on the condition and the disability. So we have got some guidance on the website on that. And the key thing is that they are able to provide appropriate evidence that supports the candidate's reasonable adjustment request. So it would explain the nature of the conditional disability, how it affects the candidates, and then it would also ideally explain what type of reasonable adjustment should be put in place for this particular candidate. And then Jackie's team can look at that evidence and then hopefully put that put those adjustments in place for the candidate. So that would be my advice. Look at the guidance we've got there. We've got some specific guidance for those that have particular learning difficulties as well. And then again, if candidates are unsure, then get in touch, speak to a member of Jackie's team, and they can help you with that process in terms of the evidence that might be needed.
Thank you, Yanis. And sensible question here: do I need to make a separate request for SQE1 and SQE2? Maybe Jackie, if you could pick that up.
Yes, certainly. Well, the SQE1 exams and the SQE2 exams are very different. We've got the multiple choice questions for SQE2. We've got written assessments in multiple choice questions in SQE1, and then SQE2 we've got written element and an oral element. So, and the assessments are at different times. So a condition may change or it may not change. So the approach that we have taken for SQE1 for the November exams is that we are agreeing reasonable adjustments for SQE1, and then we'll liaise for this first run, we'll liaise with all of those candidates to agree the adjustments for the written element of SQE2 and the oral element for SQE2. Now, those adjustments may be the same, but it would depend on either a disability or a condition as to whether or not we need to make some slight changes or some slight adjustments that are relevant for those two different exams.
Yeah, and I suppose the principle of not making presumptions about people and going back, excuse me, to the candidate themselves and saying, you know, this is a slightly different setup. What do you need? That makes perfect sense to me. And then the final question: will my details be shared with other organisations for those that are getting in touch with you with this sensitive information? I can see you shaking your head, Jackie.
Pick that up. Absolutely not. And we have a number of very, very strict systems in place within Kaplan as well. So the information that candidates provide, their equality and diversity information, and also the information about the nature of a disability or a condition or the adjustments that are sought and the discussions, it is confidential to my team. It isn't shared with anybody outside Kaplan. It isn't shared with any of the other teams within Kaplan. Obviously, the assessment team and the test centre and the operations team are aware of the adjustments that are in place, but not the conversations or the detail sitting around that.
Okay, great. So I just want to say thank you to the speakers for all your time. And I think there should be a slide coming up on the screen with the key contact details if you want to get in touch with the team at Kaplan. And we can check if any questions haven't been answered. We can obviously put those people in contact with yourselves. It makes sense, Jackie and Yanis. And there is also a link below for feedback on this webinar, and it really does help us if you can let us know what you think and if there's anything that we can improve on or what sort of future events you might find helpful. So thanks again to the speakers and for all of you for joining us to talk about this important topic.